Escape from Labyrinth by Edward White. Read by the author. Chapter 1. An unexpected portal. It was a warm, sunny summer's day in the village of Tolheath. A perfect day, and one might have thought it would be a time to play ball games with friends, climb trees, and get up to boyish mischief. But not according to Sam's parents. They had told him to go to Tolheath Village Library and take out a book for the summer, read it and write a lengthy review on it, and give it to his tutor to read. So boring. Sam didn't think it was fair. His parents couldn't read, and spent most of their days working on the farm. Why had they asked their friend and neighbour, Jeremy, to teach him? Reading, writing, and advanced mathematics clearly weren't necessary for growing up. Besides, he thought, walking up the country path, I already know how to write reviews of books, so why do I need to keep writing these reviews? If only I could do something exciting and actually important. Sam wished he was 16 years old rather than 12, because then he would be able to make his own decisions. But for now, he'd have to do what his parents said. He looked towards the hills in the distance. He saw the boring local church on the foremost boring hill, where everyone gathered to worship the World Maker, who had allowed such a boring village to exist. Sam wanted to do something that was fun, something exciting. He wanted to go out into the world and go on some adventure. Perhaps he could try becoming Sir Wulf's squire, since he lived nearby, and then he would get to have fun and do important things. Anything would be better than writing book reviews, he thought, as he approached the library. I wish I could go on some journey or adventure. The library was a lovely building, made of dark red stone from a local quarry, like all the houses in the village. The front of the building was impeccably clean, and the sides were covered with green ivy, which politely avoided smothering the clean white windows and shutters. The library was only 20 years old, and had been built after the King of High Realm had decreed that all villages in the kingdom should have easy access to books, especially books of learning. Only 50 years ago, such a decree would have been impossible to enact, but the advent of printing machines had allowed for the mass production of books, and Sam was lucky to benefit from both the king's decree and the recent innovation of printing. Sam entered through the library's bright red door, and was greeted by the cheery librarian, Edith. She was one of the 7 people in Tolheath who could read, and that included Sam. Hello, Samuel, she said happily. Sam almost cringed. Everyone seemed to think Sam was short for Samuel, which it wasn't. His parents had just named him Sam, but Edith was so lovely and kind that he didn't say anything. Hello, Edith, he said. Have you come to collect another book? She asked, closing the romance novel she was reading. Yes, he said. Have any new ones come in? The library didn't have a large collection of books, it had to be said. There were a couple of books on animals, but they were written in a language that Sam couldn't read, and some weird ones with lengthy titles placed in the philosophy section, but they had really long words and seemed to be about people giving their opinion on things. Boring. Then there was the fictional section. Over the past 2 years, Sam had read all of the interesting books in that section, and he didn't want to pick up something really long and lengthy, as it would take more time to write a report on it. Yes, said Edith. We have just had a new batch in recently. Most of them are academic works, but there is one fictional book. It's the blue one. I've put it on the novel shelf. Thanks, said Sam. He made his way towards the novel shelf and began searching for it. He found it very quickly. The spine of the book held its title, Labyrinth. It looked to be a short book. It was rather thin, and not very tall. Brilliant, Sam thought, taking it off the wooden shelf. I'm sure it will be a quick read, very easy to finish and write a report on. He lifted it, and opened the pages. Strange, he thought. There is no chapter list. He flicked through the pages, but there was no writing at all. There weren't even pictures. All the pages were blank. There must be a mistake, Sam thought. As Sam turned his head towards the counter to ask Edith why the book was blank, he felt a glow on his face from below. He looked down and saw that the book no longer had blank pages. They had strange symbols on them, which Sam did not recognize. They were golden, and they were shining brightly, and the paper itself was emitting a fuzzy light. Sam probably should have felt scared and dropped the book. In fact, if he had done so at that moment, perhaps he would have been spared from the great adventure he was unwillingly pulled into. But instead of feeling fear, Sam only felt curiosity, and looked at the book in silence, transfixed by the symbols which appeared to be spinning and twirling across the paper. He'd never seen a book do this before, and it was fascinating to watch. He heard Edith say something, but her voice was cut off abruptly, and Sam had the sensation that he was somewhere else. He looked up from the glowing book and shrieked in shock. He was somewhere else. The library and its wooden shelves, rich red walls and musty books, and big windows letting in golden sunbeams were replaced with cold grey walls, which were illuminated by a strange, dim, bluey-grey light. The book slipped from Sam's hands, and he felt his head start spinning as he twirled around trying to take in his new surroundings. But he couldn't. It was too much. He couldn't tell the shape of the room, where the light was coming from, how many exits and entrances there were, and where the walls and ceiling met. Sam's brain was simply overloaded with too much new information and far too quickly. He stumbled backwards and fell onto the floor. His breathing was out of control and his heart was pounding furiously. He was starting to feel scared and sick all at once. Then he saw the book lying right next to him. He snatched it off the ground and opened it again. The shining golden symbols were gone, but the paper was still glowing softly, although Sam was aware that the light was dimming. In this foreign and dark place, the book was the only source of familiarity and warm light, so Sam held it close and looked at it for comfort. After doing so for a few minutes, he had calmed down significantly and was able to look around the room. It was square, made of grey stone, completely enclosed, apart from one passageway ahead of him. He still couldn't figure out where the strange light was coming from, though. "Where am I?" he thought, looking around the room again. He looked down at the book on his lap. It had now stopped glowing, and looked like a normal book. But it can't be normal, Sam thought, looking at the book. It must be magical. Sam didn't know much about magic, but his parents, friends, neighbours and tutor had told him enough about it. Those with the ability and the talent could learn to use magic for many things, including creating portals and teleporting objects or people. It made sense to him that someone had enchanted the book so that anyone who opened it would be teleported to this room. Although there was an alternate explanation. "I must be dreaming," Sam said aloud. This made more sense than magic, Sam reasoned. After all, who would want to take anyone from his village? Nobody of any importance lived there, and nobody did anything worthwhile. "I must be dreaming," Sam repeated, reassuring himself. "I'll wake up soon. Nothing this exciting ever happens to me." So he sat there waiting for this dream of his to do something bizarre, because his dreams normally made no sense, and random things tended to happen. Like that time he dreamt he was in a land of sand, and he told someone next to him that they were in a desert, and the person misheard him, and thought he said dessert, and then the desert turned into an enormous cake. Sam might have sat there for hours waiting for something dreamlike to happen, before realizing he was not actually in a dream. However, he soon had an experience that proved to him he was not asleep in his bedroom. While he was sitting there, he became aware of a gust of warm air hitting his back. Not nice and warm like that of a summer breeze, but instead hot and moist, and similar to breath. Sam did not have time to turn around and see where this sudden gust came from, because he immediately felt something heavy and hairy tap his shoulder. He shouted, jumped to his feet, and turned around all at once, freezing in terror at the sight of the creature before him. It stood at 5 feet tall, and had 8 hairy, spindly legs attached to a brown, bulbous body, and was looking at him with 4 bright red eyes, devoid of emotion and warmth. Below its ugly head, 2 black woolly fangs twitched. Sam had never seen a spider this big in his life, and he had never felt so terrified. Although he could feel himself sweating, he felt as cold as stone. The spider lifted one of its limbs, and suddenly Sam's legs sprang to life. He turned and ran through the passageway ahead of him. He sensed the monstrosity scuttle after him, and he ran even faster. The passageway was long, and Sam wasn't sure that in a straight run he'd be able to outpace the creature. However, there were other passageways linked to the corridor, and he turned down the first one he saw. Sam never looked back to see if the spider was still chasing him, because he could hear it. The monstrous spider not only made shuffling sounds, but a horrible shrieking noise as well. So he knew that it was still chasing him, as he ran down passageway after passageway. Every time he came across a new opening, he ran down it. The number of passageways seemed endless, and he had no idea where he was going, but his instincts told him to keep running and not stop until his legs gave out from under him. Then he turned down another passageway and found to his dismay that it ended in a cold stone wall. He began hitting it as if he expected it to give way, but it was useless, and his hands were soon in agony. He turned around feeling weak and desperate. The spider was standing at the opening of the passageway, but it wasn't looking at him. It was looking down the corridor ahead with its red, beady eyes. Sam froze. It hadn't seen him yet, and it was possible that it would continue down the current passageway, giving him a chance to escape. Sam stood still and prayed that the spider wouldn't turn its head and see him. The spider stood still for a surprising amount of time, not a muscle moving in its body, or a hair on its cuticle. Finally it turned, not to look at Sam, but instead to climb the opposite wall. It looked weird to see a spider this large climb up a wall, but it did, and soon it was out of sight. A minute or two passed before Sam could accept his lucky escape, and he fell to his knees, shaking and shivering all over, singing praises to the World-Maker in his heart. After lying on the floor for what seemed like hours recovering from running, he began to crawl up the passageway again. He kept his eyes on the ceiling and moved cautiously. He was terrified that the spider might be up on the wall, waiting for him to come out, and this was really a clever ambush. However, when Sam reached the end of his little passageway and reconnected with the one he had just left, he couldn't see the spider. It wasn't on the ceiling, the walls, or at either end of the passageway. This confused Sam. He had clearly seen it climb the wall and go out of sight onto the ceiling. It can't have walked down the passageway, Sam thought. I would have heard it. Sam wondered what he should do. He didn't know where any of these passages led, and he didn't even know where he was. The stonework of each wall was so similar. There were no marks, signs, or anything. For all he knew, he could have actually run around in a circle trying to get away from the spider. He didn't want to go back the way he had came, not that he knew exactly where he had come apart from the vague direction, in case he bumped into the spider again. As Sam stood there, he heard the sound of rock grinding against rock. He turned around and saw that the wall's dead end, which he had been hitting just a few minutes ago, was moving. Or rather, the individual stones were moving and rearranging themselves into an open archway. Sam's jaw dropped. The stones had now finished moving and had formed an arched entrance into another room. It looked like the chamber he had been teleported into, but it was bigger and more brightly lit, although that could have just been his imagination. He barely thought about it before he started walking towards the entrance. He didn't know anything about the room, but it took him further away from wherever the spider was hiding, and he knew he didn't want to encounter it again. As he stepped through the archway and into the new room, he heard the stones moving behind him again. He looked, and, sure enough, the doorway was turning back into a wall. Good, Sam thought. Now the spider won't be able to follow me. He turned, and then fell backwards in horror. There, standing just 5 feet away, was the spider, glaring at him with those emotionless red eyes, its fangs quivering. Sam hadn't heard or seen it when he had entered the room, but somehow it was there. He scrambled back to the wall, desperately hoping the doorway might reappear, but, of course, it did not. He wanted to cry in terror, but he was struggling to move at all, and he couldn't seem to blink as he looked at the hairy monster in front of him. Then he stopped breathing as the spider bent its legs. It was preparing to jump. Sam's life started to flash before his eyes. Images of his village went through his mind, and right now he'd have done anything to be back there and be bored. Adventure was not all it was cracked up to be. The spider leapt through the air towards him. He fell to the ground and curled up into a ball, his arms wrapped around his head and neck, not even able to scream in terror. He waited for the spider to land on top of him, and for the inevitable bite he was destined to have by those fangs. But nothing happened. He waited for a minute, unable to move. Then, as his muscles relaxed and he mustered the courage to open his eyes, he looked. The spider was gone.